Reid often found his days dissolving into a blur of muted colors and predictable patterns. His apartment, a sterile box on the city's periphery, offered little solace beyond its reliable plumbing and consistent internet connection. He worked in data entry, a profession that demanded meticulous attention to detail but offered no actual engagement, each spreadsheet a flat landscape of numbers and text. He'd often stare out his window during lunch, watching the distant, hazy outline of the city's greenbelt, a wild, untamed fringe he rarely ventured into. A gnawing sense of something missing, something unfulfilled, often settled in his gut like undigested food. He was a man who preferred order, a clear path, but lately, his path felt like a treadmill, going nowhere fast. Yet, beneath the veneer of quiet acceptance, a stubborn current of determination ran through him, a quiet refusal to let life simply happen to him. The call came on a Tuesday, just as he was contemplating the optimal font size for a quarterly report. The voice on the other end, crisp and formal, introduced himself as the estate executor. Reid barely registered the name of the deceased relative. A great-aunt, perhaps? He remembered a single, faded photograph from his childhood, a woman with sharp eyes and a tightly drawn bun, but nothing more. The executor spoke of a will, an inheritance, and a property located off the beaten path. The late relative stipulated that the property must pass to the closest living relative willing to take possession, the executor explained, his voice devoid of inflection. That, Mr. Reid, is you. Reid's apartment suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. He'd expected nothing, wanted nothing from this forgotten relative. The property, as described, was a cabin. Not a quaint cottage, but an ancient cabin, deep within what the executor vaguely referred to as unregistered woodland. The call ended with an address, a set of instructions for collecting keys from a local agent, and a quiet request to settle the estate promptly. A week later, Reid was driving, the city shrinking in his rearview mirror until it was nothing more than a faint smudge against the horizon. The paved roads gave way to cracked asphalt, then to gravel, and finally to a barely discernible track swallowed by an aggressive wall of trees. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The forest here was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It wasn't merely dense, it felt old, its branches gnarled and interwoven, forming a canopy so thick that only scattered daggers of sunlight pierced through, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the gloom. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of his tires and the distant, mournful call of an unseen bird. He felt an odd prickle on the back of his neck, a sense of being watched, not by eyes, but by the very trees themselves. He consulted the printed directions again, the paper crinkling in his hand. Last turn at the petrified oak. He spotted it soon after, a massive, skeletal tree, its bark like hardened charcoal, its branches reaching skyward like grasping claws. He turned, the track narrowing further, the undergrowth scraping against the sides of his vehicle. The cabin appeared abruptly, a dark, squat silhouette against the deepening twilight. It was exactly as the executor had described, ancient. The wood, dark with age and moisture, seemed to sag under the weight of decades. A single, crooked chimney rose from the roof, its stones crumbling. The windows, small and grimy, were like blank, unseeing eyes. An overgrown porch sagged precariously, and a rusted pump stood sentinel beside a patch of thorny brambles. No manicured lawn, no welcoming light. Reid stepped out, the damp air instantly clinging to his clothes. He could taste the metallic tang of damp soil and something else, something vaguely acrid, like burnt sugar or old blood. He walked towards the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, mossy earth. He pushed the door wider, letting in a sliver of the fading light. The interior was Spartan, draped in dust sheets that seemed to absorb what little illumination entered. He found the fuse box, a relic of an earlier era, and after some fumbling, managed to restore power. He began a cursory inspection of the cabin, moving from room to room. There were no personal touches, no photographs, no trinkets. It felt less like a home and more like a tomb. As he moved through the small kitchen, his gaze snagged on a thick, knotted rope hanging near the back door. Curiosity, mixed with a growing unease, tugged at him. He pulled back the heavy rug covering the opening, revealing a set of rough-hewn wooden steps leading down into absolute blackness. This wasn't just a cellar. Different. He reached for the rope, his fingers brushing against its rough fibers. It felt solid, anchored. He leaned closer, trying to pierce the gloom. A faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to rise from the depths, a low vibration that resonated in his chest. Its rough, concrete-like walls were barely visible in the scant light, framing an opening that felt less like an access point and more like a hungry maw. He pulled back, his hand instinctively recoiling from the rope. The cabin had secrets, and this, he realized, was where they began. The executor's voice, a dry rustle of paper and obligation, had faded from Reid's memory, but the image of the cabin remained. Ancient. Unregistered Woodland. The words clung to him, a burr beneath the skin. He hadn't wanted this, hadn't asked for it. Yet, a strange compulsion, a pull he couldn't articulate, had driven him to pack a bag and point his old pickup truck north. The city, with its cacophony and indifferent crowds, receded in his rearview mirror, replaced by an ever-deepening emerald tunnel of trees. The paved road dissolved into gravel, then a barely discernible track swallowed by undergrowth. Branches scraped against the truck's paint, a mournful whisper against metal. Finally, the track opened into a small, overgrown clearing. There it stood. Not a cabin, not in the sense of a quaint, rustic retreat. This was a hulking, dark timber structure, its roofline sagging like an old man's shoulders, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from beneath heavy brows of moss. It looked less built than grown, a part of the forest itself, weathered by forgotten seasons. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, pressing in from all sides. No birdsong, no distant hum of traffic, just the rustle of leaves in a wind that felt too quiet. He pushed open the heavy front door. Sunlight, fractured and weak, struggled through grimy window panes, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. The main room was vast, dominated by a stone hearth choked with cobwebs. Reid moved through the space, his footsteps echoing too loudly on the wide plank floors. He pulled back a sheet from an armchair, releasing a puff of fine, gray dust. He spent the first few hours simply clearing, pushing back the tide of neglect. He swept away cobwebs thick as old lace, wiped down surfaces, and wrestled open stiff windows, allowing a tentative breeze to filter through. The faint creak of settling wood, the tap-tap-tap of a loose shutter in the wind, these were normal sounds for an old house, he told himself. Nothing to worry about. But then, the other sounds began. He froze, listening. Nothing. Just the wind whistling a low, mournful tune through the eaves. He dismissed it as the house settling, a trick of the acoustics. He spun around, his heart giving an involuntary lurch. The kitchen was empty, save for his own reflection in the grimy windowpane, distorted and gaunt. He rubbed his eyes. Fatigue, he reasoned. He was in the main room, attempting to light a fire in the ancient hearth, when he noticed it. He'd seen it earlier, noted its presence. Now, it was gone. He frowned, searching the mantelpiece again, then the floor around the hearth. He shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. He must have moved it himself, absent-mindedly, while clearing. Or perhaps it had simply fallen. The house was old, after all. He was determined to be rational. The stairs groaned under his weight, each step a protest. The attic was a cavern of forgotten things, moth-eaten trunks, rusted tools, and stacks of moldering books. He found himself drawn to a small, heavy oak chest tucked away in a dusty corner. He pried open the stiff lid. Inside, beneath layers of musty linen, lay a collection of faded photographs, their subjects stern-faced and unsmiling, and a single, leather-bound journal. The journal felt impossibly old, its cover cracked, its pages brittle. He carefully opened it. The script, a spidery, looping hand, filled the first few pages with dates from over a century ago. He could only decipher snippets, dot the pact. He scanned the cramped script, his fingers brushing against the ancient paper. The bunker. The journal hinted at something buried beneath the cabin, something vital and terrifying. He spent another hour searching the attic, then the main floor, his rationalizations beginning to fray. He finally located it in the cellar, beneath a heavy, mildewed rug. A trapdoor, almost perfectly camouflaged against the rough concrete floor, secured with a rusted, heavy bolt. He knelt, his fingers tracing the cold metal, a profound sense of dread blooming in his chest. He could feel it, an almost imperceptible vibration against his palms. The journal had mentioned it, had warned of it. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his resolve hardening even as his stomach churned with apprehension. It had been waiting for a very long time. With a grunt, he wrestled the bolt open. He descended into the underground bunker, the journal clutched tight in his hand. The attic's stale air, thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten dust, offered no further secrets. Reid spent another hour sifting through the remaining trunks, his fingers growing grimy from the undisturbed sediment of decades. No hidden compartment, no loose floorboard, no cryptic diagram. The journal's mention of the bunker remained an isolated, chilling riddle. He descended the narrow steps, the old wood groaning under his weight, a sound that seemed to linger unnaturally in the sudden quiet of the cabin. He tried to focus, to rationalize. Perhaps the relative had simply meant a root cellar, or an old shed. But the urgency in the cramped script, the stark, unsettling tone, argued against such mundane interpretations. That night, the cabin's usual creaks and groans transformed. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. A soft scuttling began in the wall beside his head, not the familiar patter of mice, but something heavier, more deliberate. It moved slowly, a faint scratching sound, like dry claws dragging across plaster, then stopped directly above his pillow. He held his breath, straining to hear. A low thrum vibrated through the mattress, a faint, rhythmic pulse that seemed to originate from deep within the earth beneath the cabin. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to dismiss it as an old house settling, but the thrumming intensified, a dull, insistent beat against his skull. When he finally drifted into a fitful sleep, it was haunted by fractured images of twisting roots and dark, subterranean spaces. The following morning, exhaustion gnawed at him. He found the kitchen window ajar, despite having locked it before bed. He slammed the window shut, a fresh wave of unease tightening his chest. This wasn't a draft. This wasn't forgetfulness. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The phenomena were escalating, becoming undeniable. He needed answers, and the cabin wasn't giving them up easily. He pulled out his laptop, grateful for the weak, intermittent signal his satellite modem provided. He started with the cabin itself, searching for its history, old property deeds, anything that might shed light on its origins or the land it occupied. His initial searches were frustrating. The cabin wasn't listed on any standard historical registries. It seemed to exist outside conventional records, a forgotten speck on the map. He widened his search to the surrounding area, the forgotten forest, the nearest small town. He found mentions of the town's founding, old lumber mills, and a smattering of local folklore. Most of it was quaint, pastoral. Then, a broken link led him to an archived local newspaper from the early 1900s. The digital scan was poor quality, but a headline jumped out at him: "Local family vanishes without a trace." He squinted, trying to decipher the faded print. The article detailed the sudden disappearance of a family, the original owners of the land, nearly a century ago. Their cabin, it vaguely described, was deep within the forest, near the old burial mounds. Burial mounds. The words sent a fresh shiver down his spine. The article offered no explanation, only speculation about wild animals or a sudden exodus. No bodies were ever found. The property, it noted, was eventually claimed by a distant relative, his own lineage. He dug deeper, searching for burial mounds and the specific forest name. He found an obscure local history blog, updated sporadically by a reclusive amateur historian. One entry, dated years ago, discussed local indigenous legends, speaking of hungry earth and ancient pacts made to appease unseen forces. The blog post mentioned a specific family name, a name that mirrored his own distant relative's surname, albeit an older variant. A responsibility that, if neglected, carried a terrible price. The post ended abruptly, hinting at further research that was never published. Reid's hands trembled as he scrolled, the words blurring on the screen. He wasn't just inheriting a cabin, he was inheriting a burden, a lineage entangled with something ancient and malevolent. The journal's cryptic warnings, his relative's sudden death, the escalating disturbances, they all began to coalesce into a terrifying, coherent narrative. It showed the approximate location of the cabin, marked simply as the old homestead. And tucked away in the corner of the property, almost deliberately obscured by a smudged ink blot, was a small, square outline labeled, in faint, precise script, "Underground Bunker." His breath hitched. It was real. Not a root cellar, not a shed. An underground bunker. The thrumming from the previous night, the metallic scent, the sense of something vast and hidden beneath his feet, it all converged on that single, terrifying revelation. He stared at the map, then at the silent, expectant cabin around him. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken history. The answers were out there, beneath him, waiting. And he had a sickening feeling they would be far worse than anything he could possibly imagine. Reid's flashlight beam cut through the oppressive gloom, a narrow cone of defiance against the absolute dark. The entrance to the underground bunker, a heavy, rusted metal hatch camouflaged beneath a tangle of thorny brambles and a thick layer of pine needles, had yielded with a groan that echoed like a dying breath. He'd had to dig for an hour, following the imprecise X on the tattered map, before his shovel struck the cold, unyielding iron. Now, a steep, earthen tunnel, shored up with rough-hewn timbers, sloped sharply downwards into the earth. It was the same scent that had permeated the cabin on certain nights, now concentrated, potent. His breath plumed in the beam, a fleeting ghost. He swallowed, the sound loud in his own ears, and began his descent. Each step on the packed earth of the ramp sent a puff of fine dust into the air, illuminated by his light. The timbers above creaked, settling under the weight of the earth, or perhaps just the shift in pressure from his presence. The thrumming, which had been a faint background hum in the cabin, grew stronger here, a low, resonant vibration that he felt in his teeth, in the soles of his boots. It was a living hum, a deep, mechanical pulse that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock. Dust motes danced in the flashlight's beam, thick as fog. The thrumming was a constant companion now, a low, guttural growl that resonated through the floor. Reid swept the light across the chamber. It was not empty. Against one curved wall stood a series of heavy wooden shelves, laden with what looked like rusted tools, glass jars filled with unidentifiable, desiccated contents, and stacks of brittle, yellowed papers. In the center of the room, a large, rectangular stone slab rested on two smaller stone blocks, like a primitive altar. He didn't want to think about what it might be. His light moved on, past a workbench cluttered with more tools, chisels, mallets, some strange, hooked instruments he couldn't name, to a small, alcove-like recess in the far wall. It was there, tucked away behind a stack of rotted burlap sacks, that he found it. Not a single journal, but a heavy, leather-bound ledger, its cover embossed with a faded, intricate symbol he didn't recognize. Its pages, thick and yellowed, were filled with a spidery, precise script. He pulled it out, the leather cracking in his hands, and carefully opened it. He ignored it, his eyes fixed on the archaic script. The first entries were mundane, dates and weather observations, but as he turned the pages, the content shifted. Names appeared, familiar surnames from the cabin's own history, alongside unsettling notations. The harvest wanes. The land hungers. The pack must be renewed. Reid's breath hitched. He flipped forward, his fingers trembling, scanning for context. The ledger detailed a lineage, his own lineage, stretching back generations. The symbol on the cover, he now realized, was repeated throughout the text, often accompanied by drawings of strange, intertwined roots, reaching deep into the earth. The land demands its due. The old ways must be kept, or all is lost. The sacrifice, a binding. A portion of life, to feed the soil, to appease the ancient hunger. It is not a demon from without, but a hunger from within the earth itself, awakened by the first settlers, bound by our ancestors' desperation. The entity wasn't some wandering spirit. It was intrinsically tied to the land, a deep, ancient hunger stirred and then fed by his own family. The ledger described a specific ritual, performed at certain celestial alignments, involving the keeper and an offering. A sudden, sharp metallic clang echoed from deeper within the bunker, a sound like heavy chain dragging across stone. Reid flinched, his head snapping up. He clutched the ledger tighter, his knuckles white. This wasn't just history, it was a living, breathing horror. His ancestors hadn't just settled here, they had made a deal with something ancient and terrible, something that now considered him part of the bargain. The cabin wasn't just on an ancient burial ground, it was a focal point for a malevolent entity, an anchor for a pact that demanded a continuous toll. And he, Reid, was the latest in a long, unwilling line of inheritors. He was no longer just exploring a mystery, he was caught in a legacy of sacrifice, and the hunger of the land was turning its attention to him. The ledger's brittle pages lay open on the warped pine table, the words tributes, sustenance, and the cost of peace still clawing at Reid's mind. A cold sweat slicked his palms, not just from the cabin's oppressive chill, but from the dawning horror of what he was reading. The cryptic ritual, the celestial alignments, the keeper, it all pointed to something far older, far more demanding than simple superstition. A hidden chamber. A deeper secret. His gaze drifted to the cellar door, a heavy slab of wood he'd barely noticed since arriving. The air around it felt different, heavier, as if absorbing all sound. Driven by a morbid curiosity, a desperate need to understand, he pushed himself from the table. He unlatched the door, the iron complaining with a drawn-out shriek, and descended into the cabin's shallow cellar. He swept his flashlight beam across the packed earth. The ledger's diagram had shown a specific point, a convergence. He knelt, pushing the pail aside, and ran his fingers over the subtle indentation. It wasn't a natural crack. With a grunt, he dug his fingers into the seam, pulling at the stubborn earth. Beneath the soil, he felt the cold, smooth surface of worked stone. It took him a strained half-hour, digging with his bare hands in the rusted pail, to uncover a square stone hatch, almost perfectly camouflaged. A heavy iron ring, encrusted with rust, lay flat against its surface. He gripped it, testing the weight. It was solid. He pulled. The hatch resisted, then lifted with a grating scrape that echoed unnaturally in the small space. This was it. This was the underground bunker. He descended into the black, the flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the gloom. The steps were rough-hewn rock, uneven and slick with moisture. The air grew thick, pressing in on him, making each breath a conscious effort. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of his boots and the frantic thrum of his own blood in his ears. The walls were rough-cut stone, streaked with what looked like dried mineral deposits. In the center, a crude stone pillar rose from the floor, adorned with the same unsettling symbols he'd seen in the ledger. He moved deeper into the bunker, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone, though he knew there would be no signal down here. He felt a sudden, sharp drop in temperature, as if a pocket of Arctic air had materialized beside him. It wasn't a language he knew, yet it carried an undeniable undercurrent of malevolence, a predatory hunger. The air shimmered. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, convinced his vision was playing tricks on him in the dim light. But when he opened them again, the symbols on the central pillar seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, like embers breathing. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the stone floor beneath his feet. Then, his phone, clutched in his hand, vibrated violently. He stared at it, bewildered. No signal. How? The screen flickered to life, displaying a single, garbled word he couldn't quite make out, followed by a series of distorted, guttural sounds that coalesced, terrifyingly, into a semblance of a voice. It wasn't human. It was a mimicry, a grotesque parody of his sister's voice, twisted into a slow, drawn-out plea for help that dissolved into a choked gasp. The phone went dead, the screen black. Reid stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. It knew. It wasn't confined to the cabin, or even this bunker. It knew about his sister. The cabin wasn't just a place of unease, it was a living trap, its tendrils reaching out, threatening to ensnare those he cared about. He looked around the bunker, the pulsing symbols on the pillar now seeming to mock him, the effigies on the shelves like watchful eyes. His gaze fell upon a small, leather-bound book, half hidden behind one of the wooden figures. The first page was not writing, but a single, intricate family tree, meticulously drawn. It started generations ago, branching down, until it reached a line that ended with his own name. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just an inheritor, he was the next in line. The entity wasn't just claiming the cabin, it was claiming him. There was no escape. Not anymore. The words of the ledger, scrawled in a hand that had long since turned to dust, still writhed behind Reid's eyes. Tributes. Sustenance. The cost of peace. A cold sweat had long since replaced the cabin's oppressive chill on his skin, a visceral reaction to the dawning horror. He couldn't stay. Not another minute. A desperate resolve hardened in his chest, a counterpoint to the fear that threatened to paralyze him. He had to get out, find someone, anyone, who could make sense of this madness, or at least confirm he wasn't losing his mind. He snatched his keys from the warped pine table, the metal cold and solid in his grasp, a fleeting touchstone to a sane world. The forest loomed, a wall of skeletal trees against the bruised twilight sky. He didn't hesitate, plunging onto the narrow, overgrown path that led back towards what he hoped was civilization. The path, once vaguely discernible, began to play tricks on him. A fallen log he'd stepped over moments ago seemed to reappear ahead, an impossible loop. He could hear it then, a faint, rhythmic thud, like something heavy being dragged over uneven ground, always just out of sight, always behind him. He quickened his pace, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the air searing his lungs. Panic began to claw at the edges of his determination. He pushed harder, ignoring the brambles that tore at his jeans, the twigs that snapped underfoot like breaking bones. He remembered the old pickup truck, parked half a mile down a barely maintained logging road. If he could just reach it. But the forest refused to yield. Every turn looked the same. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs, but saw nothing but the deepening gloom and the silent, watching trees. He was being herded, not guided. Then, a flicker of light, unnatural and low, caught his eye through a break in the pines. It wasn't the cabin, nor the road. A memory, vague and unsettling, surfaced from the ledger's cryptic notes, a diagram, crude and marked with an X near a symbol that looked like a downward-pointing arrow. The vault. He found himself stumbling towards it, his legs moving almost independently of his will, as if drawn by an unseen current. Before him, half buried under centuries of fallen leaves and moss, was a squat, concrete structure, almost perfectly camouflaged. A heavy, rusted metal door, set flush into the side of the embankment, confirmed it. An underground bunker. It was an anomaly in this ancient wilderness, a stark, brutal testament to a past he was only just beginning to uncover. Hesitantly, Reid pushed against the door. He fumbled for his phone, its flashlight beam cutting a weak swathe through the gloom. The underground bunker was small, a single room with concrete walls weeping moisture. Empty shelves lined one side, rusted and skeletal. On the far wall, however, a section of the concrete seemed newer, patched. A faint outline of a door. Another door. Driven by a morbid curiosity, and perhaps a flicker of desperate hope that this place might hold an answer, a weapon, anything to fight back, he found the latch. He pulled it back with a grating shriek that echoed in the confined space. The hidden compartment was less a room and more a narrow, vertical shaft, barely wider than his shoulders, descending into an even deeper blackness. The flashlight beam struggled to penetrate it. As he leaned closer, a faint, sweet, cloying smell intensified, making his stomach churn. It was the same smell he'd noticed outside the cabin, now concentrated, sickeningly potent. His beam finally caught something. Not a floor, not an end. A child's wooden toy, a small, intricate carving of a bird. A silver locket, tarnished and open, revealing faded, sepia photographs of two smiling faces. A worn leather-bound journal, its pages brittle, clutched shut by a thin, desiccated ribbon. These weren't relics of an ancient civilization. These were recent. Personal. Each item hummed with a quiet, devastating grief. These were the possessions of people, individuals, who had vanished. The tributes mentioned in the ledger. Not livestock, not abstract offerings. People. Reid's breath hitched. The walls of the narrow shaft seemed to press in on him, the air growing impossibly thin. The forest hadn't let him escape, it had led him directly to the heart of the horror, to the proof of the cost of peace. The slab, hidden beneath a tangle of root and decaying leaves, was the entrance to the underground bunker. A cold, metallic breath seeped from its edges, tasting of disturbed earth and something sharp, like old iron. His legs, still moving with a strange, autonomous will, carried him forward. He pulled at the slab, a groan of ancient stone protesting as it scraped aside, revealing a gaping maw of darkness. Rough-hewn steps, barely visible, descended into the black. Yet, he felt a pull, an irresistible current drawing him. Deeper. He began his descent, each step a hesitant plunge into the unknown. The passage twisted, narrowed, and then opened into a vast, circular chamber. The bunker was larger than he could have imagined, a forgotten cavern carved deep beneath the forest floor. The air hung heavy, thick with an almost palpable pressure, like being at the bottom of a deep ocean trench. His flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing walls covered in intricate, unsettling carvings. They were not illustrations of events, but complex, swirling patterns, knotwork that seemed to writhe and contort, hinting at eyes and mouths hidden within their lines. As he drew closer, the carvings on the pedestal became clearer. They depicted figures, not human, not animal, but something in between, skeletal and elongated, with grasping, multi-jointed limbs. And within that basin, resting on a bed of dried, crumbling leaves, was a single, tarnished silver locket. It was the same locket he'd found in the cabin, the one with the faded portrait of a stern-faced ancestor. A wave of vertigo washed over him as he reached for it. His fingers brushed the cold metal, and a searing jolt, like ice and fire, shot up his arm. Visions erupted in his mind, not seen, but felt. He was there, generations ago, standing in this very chamber, but it was filled with flickering torchlight. His ancestor, the man in the locket, stood before the pedestal, his face etched with a desperate, terrible resolve. He spoke words Reid couldn't comprehend, words that vibrated with ancient power and invocation. The air crackled, and from the earth itself, from the very roots of the forest above, something stirred. It was not a physical being, but a hunger, a vast, consuming emptiness given shape by the ritual, a gaping maw that demanded sustenance. It was the parasitic heart of the forest, an insatiable hunger that fed on life, on vitality, on blood. The ancestor, desperate to save his failing crops, his dying family, had offered it a bargain, not just a sacrifice, but a lineage. A continuous offering, drawn from his own bloodline, ensuring the land's bounty in exchange for a slow, generational drain of life. The carvings on the walls were not art, but a chronicle. Each swirl and knot represented a generation, a sacrifice. The elongated figures, forever reaching, were the entity's tendrils, drawing life force. He saw the sudden illnesses, the mysterious accidents, the unexplained disappearances that plagued his family's history, dismissed as misfortune. They weren't. They were the entity's regular tithe, its due. And the locket, the symbol of his lineage, was also a key, a conduit. It wasn't just a sentimental keepsake, it was a binding artifact, linking him, the current living descendant, directly to the pact. The entity had been dormant, perhaps, or merely sated for a time, but the cabin's inheritance, his presence, had reawakened its deepest hunger. They were the entity's probing tendrils, its ravenous anticipation. It wasn't simply haunting the cabin, it was consuming it, and him along with it. The sacrifice, the horrific demand, slammed into his consciousness with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a life. It needed a life, freely given, of the purest bloodline, to renew its power, to sate it for another generation. Or, perhaps, to be utterly defeated. But the vision implied only one option for his ancestor: appeasement. The entity wasn't something that could be reasoned with or destroyed by conventional means. It was a force of nature, corrupted by human desperation, and it demanded a price. His own life. Or the life of someone he cared for deeply. He wasn't just in the bunker, he was inside the entity's maw, utterly exposed, utterly vulnerable. He was trapped, not just in this chamber, but in a horrific legacy. The determination that had driven him here solidified, now tempered with a desperate, primal fear. He had found the truth, and the truth was a monstrous, hungry thing, and it was waiting for him. He pulled at the stone slab, the faint symbol. Beneath his fingers, feeling rough, alien. It resisted, groaning with the weight of centuries, but eventually gave way with a grinding scrape that echoed into the hollow dark below. A gust of stagnant air, thick with the scent of decay and something acrid, like old blood and rust, washed over him. A crude ladder, fashioned from thick, knotted timbers, descended into absolute blackness. There was no going back. His hands, slick with sweat and grime, found purchase on the rough wood. The bunker itself was not large, a roughly hewn chamber, the walls lined with crude, unmortared stones that glistened with moisture. Water dripped somewhere in the unseen corners, a monotonous, maddening rhythm. Around it, carved into the very walls, were symbols identical to the one on the slab above and others, more intricate, disturbing. On the altar, half buried under a layer of fine dust, lay a leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked, its pages brittle. Reid's fingers trembled as he picked it up. The script inside was faded, spidery, but legible. It was a chronicle, a meticulous, terrifying record kept by his distant relative. The entity demanded not just sacrifice, but a slow, agonizing surrender of self, a twisting of reality until the line between sanity and madness blurred. The cabin wasn't just its lair, it was its stomach, slowly digesting those within. Reid's relative hadn't died suddenly, he had been consumed, his mind and body systematically dismantled. It spoke of the entity's hunger, its parasitic nature, its ability to twist the very fabric of the world around its victim. The symbol, Reid now understood, was not just an identifier, it was a brand, a claim. The pact demanded a steward, a conduit. And now, that role had fallen to him. The journal's final entry was a scrawled, desperate plea, a warning. It seeks the core. The heart. It wants it broken, not just given. He clutched the journal, its ancient leather growing warm in his grip. The truth was far more insidious than he could have imagined. This wasn't about a simple ritual to appease a spirit. This was about severing a parasitic bond, generations deep. The only way was to deny it what it sought, his broken core. Reid scrambled back up the ladder, his mind racing. The cabin, the true heart of the entity's power, awaited. He burst from the bunker, gasping in the cool forest air, the journal tucked securely in his jacket. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. He marched towards it, determination a bitter taste in his mouth, the fear still a live thing, writhing in his gut, but now sharpened by purpose. He would not be another entry in that cursed journal. The cabin's front door hung ajar, a black maw. Inside, the air was thick, suffocating. The familiar smells of damp wood and dust were overlaid with something else, something metallic and sweet, like the bunker, but intensified. The furniture was overturned, shards of ceramic glinted on the floor, and a thin, greasy film seemed to coat every surface. He pulled out the journal, flipping to a page that detailed a counter-ritual, a desperate gamble. It wasn't about destroying the entity, but about breaking the lineage, severing the feed. It required a sacrifice, yes, but not of life. Of will. Of memory. As he began to read aloud the archaic words, the cabin roared. The floorboards buckled, the walls groaned, and timbers shrieked as if in agony. The entity was here, in its full, terrible power, fighting back. It didn't want its food supply cut off. It wanted him. It wanted his broken core. He would break the pact. The metallic tang of rust and damp concrete still clung to the back of Reid's throat, a taste he suspected would forever be a phantom on his tongue. He lay sprawled on the cold floor of the underground bunker, his body a collection of screaming ligaments and bruised bone. His fingers, caked with grime and something else, something that felt like dried, flaked ash, still twitched, recalling the desperate grip he'd maintained on the journal. The air in the bunker, usually thick with the scent of forgotten things, now carried a faint, acrid undertone, like ozone after a lightning strike, or burnt offerings. The reverberation of the sound in the confined space was jarring, a stark reminder of the profound quiet that had descended. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a presence of silence, heavy and suffocating. He remembered the final moments, or fragments of them. The guttural cry that wasn't his own, the blinding flash of internal light, the sensation of something tearing, not flesh, but something far deeper, like a root being violently wrenched from the earth. He'd followed the instructions, whispered the incantations, his voice hoarse and raw. The journal had pulsed then, a living thing in his hands, its pages fluttering with an unseen wind. And then, the severing. But its absence wasn't relief. It was a terrifying vacuum. He dragged himself to the steel door, his reflection in its polished surface a gaunt, wild-eyed stranger. But it was his eyes that held him captive. They were too wide, too bright, reflecting not just the bunker's dim light, but a deeper, unsettling lucidity, as if he'd seen too much, understood too much, and could never unsee or unknow. He unlatched the heavy bolts, the metal scraping echoing loudly. The climb out of the underground bunker was a slow, arduous task, his limbs protesting every step. When he finally emerged into the dappled light of the forest, the world felt different. The air was still, the usual symphony of rustling leaves and chirping birds muted, almost reverent. The cabin stood before him, bathed in the pale morning sun, an impossible stillness clinging to its weathered timbers. It looked utterly normal. Too normal. The air was crisp, clean, carrying only the scent of pine and damp earth. He pushed open the front door. No creaking protest. The interior was dust-laden, just as he'd left it, but the suffocating weight that had always pressed down on him inside these walls was gone. The air felt breathable, almost light. He walked through the living room, past the hearth where countless fires had burned, through the kitchen, into the study where he'd first found the journal. The cabin was simply a cabin, old and neglected, waiting. And that was the cost. The horror was gone, yes, but it had taken something with it. The constant fear had been a perverse kind of energy, a frantic pulse that had driven him. Now, in its place, was this profound, unnerving calm. His connection to the vibrant chaos of life felt tenuous, muted. The colors of the forest seemed less vivid, the warmth of the sun on his skin less comforting. He had severed the parasitic bond, but in doing so, he had also severed a part of himself, a part that he now realized had been inextricably linked to the very intensity of his fear, his will to survive. He touched his chest, over his heart. There was no ache, no pounding, just a steady, almost indifferent rhythm. The world no longer felt threatening, but it also no longer felt fully real. The entity was gone, starved, disconnected. The single, bare bulb hanging above swayed ever so slightly, casting long, jittery shadows that danced like mocking spirits across the rough-hewn walls. His eyes, swollen and gritty, tracked their movements, a dull ache throbbing behind his temples. He didn't know how long he'd been there. Hours, perhaps. Or merely minutes stretched into an eternity by the sheer exhaustion that had settled deep within his bones. The profound silence that now permeated the bunker was the loudest thing of all, a stark contrast to the cacophony of whispers, growls, and the bone-jarring echoes of his own desperate actions that had preceded it. He had done what he had to do. The very fabric of the bunker, which had seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, now felt inert, just stone and soil. He pushed himself up, every muscle protesting, a groan escaping his lips. His vision swam, and the world tilted precariously. He braced himself against a damp wall, the rough concrete scraping against his cheek, a sensation that anchored him to the present. He was alive. He had survived. The climb out was an agonizing ordeal. Each rung of the rusted ladder was a new challenge, each upward pull a testament to a strength he hadn't known he possessed until it was demanded of him. His hands were raw, slick with sweat and grime, but he didn't stop, didn't look back. He emerged into the twilight, the air a cool balm against his feverish skin. The forest, which had felt like a suffocating shroud for so long, now seemed to breathe with him, a deep, resonant sigh. The trees stood tall, their leaves rustling in a gentle breeze, a sound that was suddenly peaceful, not menacing. He stood for a long moment, simply inhaling the scent of pine and damp earth, letting the cool air fill his lungs. It looked ordinary. Deceptively so. The weathered wood, the sagging porch, the single, unlit window, it was just a structure now, stripped of its malevolent aura, or so he hoped. He walked towards it, his steps slow and deliberate, a strange mixture of relief and trepidation churning in his gut. He didn't enter. He couldn't. The pact, the entity, the lineage of sacrifice, it had all culminated here, in this forgotten corner of the world. He had fought, not just for his own survival, but to break a cycle, to sever a connection that had festered for generations. He believed he had succeeded. Turning his back on the cabin, he began to walk. He didn't know where he was going, only that it was away. He left the forest path, pushing through overgrown brush, his clothes snagging on thorns, his skin prickling with phantom touches. The journey was a blur of pain and determination. He kept walking, the rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot a monotonous comfort. The further he moved from the cabin, the more the forest seemed to recede, its dense canopy giving way to glimpses of a bruised, purple sky. Yet, even as he distanced himself physically, he knew the experience had fundamentally altered him. He reached the edge of the forest just as the first stars began to prick the sky. The world beyond looked alien, too bright, too loud, too normal star. He was no longer the man who had arrived at the cabin weeks ago. The naive curiosity had been replaced by a grim understanding, the innocent wonder by a profound weariness. As he finally stepped onto a paved road, the distant hum of a passing vehicle a jarring intrusion, he paused. He glanced back one last time. He saw nothing specific, no glowing eyes, no shimmering distortions. Just trees. Yet, a shiver traced its way down his spine. The silence was profound, but not empty. It felt observant. As if the forest, the very land itself, was watching him go, holding its breath, waiting. He had broken the pact, he was sure, but the echoes of such a history, such a malevolence, never truly vanished. They simply receded, waiting for the next tremor, the next crack in the fragile veneer of the world.